So you remember the theme of our special evening? We're coming back to the 40s. Now, let's appreciate the efforts that some of you have made. I'm seeing some really nice hats, gloves, here, dresses over there, suits as well. Thank you. I am truly impressed. Well, if we had to give an award for the best outfits, we would certainly celebrate, let me see, these people here. Oh, hi, what's your name? Sorry. Oh, Christina, but I know you. You're from the Picnic Center Company in Washington, D.C., is that right? Yeah. Ah, please. So tonight, we wanted to honor Jean Monnet's life and legacy. What better way than performing some episodes from his life on stage? What do you think? Ah. So Christina wrote a 15-minute play, original play, in collaboration with Jean-Marc Lieberherr, grandson of Jean Monnet, who is just here. So thanks to you both, we're gonna see just here presidents, statesmen, historical figures who knew him. And also, we will hear the conversation on a bench, just here. Actually, in Rock Creek Park, we're not so far from here, with the person he loved most, his wife. This play highlights his time here in Washington, D.C. as a European and advisor to several US administrations. Well, I don't want to keep you any longer. The show's about to start. If you're inside, please join us out here, and I hope you all enjoy the play.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Baudouin. Thank you to Ambassador Etienne, Baudouin Carrard, Hugo Vergès, and Marie-Hélène Zavala. It's an honor for the Picnic Theater Company of Washington, D.C. to be here to present an original play about the life of Jean Monnet as commissioned by the Embassy of France for this event, written in collaboration with Jean-Marc Lieberherr. We are D.C. professionals by day, journalists, government officials, diplomats, and private sector, thespians by night, all volunteer troupe. We hope you enjoy this presentation of An Afternoon in Rock Creek Park with Jean Monnet.
Thank you, Christina.
We were at Rock Creek Park on a summer afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the leaves of the trees and falling onto a wooden shade-dappled bench. It's a gift from France, and it's a symbol of Franco-American partnership and European-American friendship. It's also a memorial to a man, Jean Monnet. He was a visionary for a unified Europe that enjoyed the peace and prosperity made possible only through the creation of strong institutions that could overcome the scourge of 2 world wars. Today we'll hear that story about Jean through the words and voices of dignitaries, statesmen, and presidents, as well as his wife, Madame Silvia Monnet, an Italian painter who approaches now.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Bonjour, Madame Monnet.
Isn't it a beautiful day? Jean loved strolling here in Rock Creek Park in the early morning before he went to his office on Massachusetts Avenue. This is where he really worked. He used to say his legs were doing the thinking for him. These morning walks would help clarify his mind, and prepare him for a day's work. When we returned to France in 1945, after the war, we bought our house outside of Paris in the woods near Houjaret, so he could maintain this morning routine. I think it is here, in Rock Creek Park, that Jean first formulated in his mind his ideas for uniting Europe. You see, Jean never sought the spotlight. He never drew a crowd, said he had no talent for it. But he wielded tremendous influence at key junctures in history and forever changed the future of the European continent. And all the while, he cared deeply for me and for our two daughters, Anna and Marianne. In our 45 years of marriage, he always confided in me and sought my counsel. We met at a dinner party in Paris at his place in August of 1929. I was 22 years old and just married to another man. Jean was 41 and very much a bachelor. But it was love at first sight, and despite the complications, we were married in Moscow in 1934. But that story would take another evening to recount. Ours was an adventurous life. We lived between Paris and London and New York and even Shanghai when Jean was an advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. He also had many friends in the Roosevelt administration from his days in international business and banking. So naturally, the French and then the British turned to him when it came to securing American planes to fight Nazi Germany. Americans and Europeans could always agree that Jean was tenacious. He fought relentlessly when it came to the things that he truly believed in. Ah, here he is now.
My friend, Senator Dwight Morrow, used to say that there are two kinds of men: those who want to be someone and those who want to do something. I chose to belong to the second category.
Your training in business certainly turned you into a problem solver. Do you remember how proud your mother was of your accomplishments for the family cognac company? You could do no wrong. And she was just like you, only interested in practical ideas.
She was a disciplined and determined woman. She was also patient. The great thing about making cognac is that it teaches you above all else to be patient. I can wait long for the right circumstances to act. In cognac, we know how to wait. It is the only way to make good product.
My son Jean was born in 1888 in Cognac, in southwestern France. His father, Jean-Gabriel, my husband, founded our family cognac business, J.G. Monnet & Co., and taught our son the trade. He was so taken by the cognac that even before finishing schools, at the age of 16, he asked to go to London and then to Canada to learn with our agents and expand the business. He was really good at it. At the tender age of 22, he convinced the Hudson Bay Company to exclusively sell his father's cognac in a large part of the Canadian market. He was extraordinarily convincing, and he learned that you must be a salesman for your ideas as much as you are for your product. And he did exactly that. He did exactly that. When he, by some, chance, managed to convince the French Premier in 1914 to send him to London to help arrange French and English war supplies. He was just 26 years old then.
The Allied committees for wheat and shipping during World War I were a great success and made your reputation. The French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau was a strong supporter.
Yes, it is with his support that I became number 2 at the League of Nations, the first international organization set up to preserve peace. But I became disappointed. Member countries wanted to advance their own national interest rather than working on common solutions to common problems. It did not work. And so I left and returned back into business. And that is a good thing, because otherwise we would not have met.
Yes, but later you were to return to public service, never to go back into business.
Indeed. At the outbreak of World War II, I was called to organize joint French and British production and rearmament. You see, I'd done it all before during the First World War. In the spring of 1940, when it became clear that France would fall, I made Churchill and de Gaulle the most audacious proposal of my life. Next, of course, to marrying you, my dear. A total union between France and England. One country, one people, one army. They accepted, but it was too late. I learned a very important lesson, though. Politicians, in the time of crisis, will listen to those who come with ideas, and the unthinkable can be achieved. When France did fall in 1940, Mr. Churchill sent me here to Washington to pursue my sourcing mission as a member of the British Supply Council. That's when we moved to our house on Vauxhall Road. Remember?
I sure do. Those were memorable times. You had many friends in the Roosevelt administration, so you hit the ground running straight away.
My objective was to convince Roosevelt to at least double American production plans. And so we created a working group of sorts of advisors and military generals whose influence on the White House was well known. We dined together, often at our home here in Vauxhall Road. We telephoned. We exchanged notes at all hours of the day and night. One evening, as we dined with friends of President Roosevelt, I said, the United States must become a great arsenal, the arsenal of democracy. Well, my friend, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, who was with us at the time, asked if I wouldn't mind holding on to that line just for a little while. Few days later, we sat and listened to President Roosevelt's famous radio fireside chat of December 29th.
A nation can have peace with the Nazis only at the price of total surrender. We cannot escape danger or the fear of it by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must produce arms and ships with every energy and resource we can command. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
You were certainly an important architect of the Victory Program, Jean. Do you remember what Roosevelt's closest advisor, Harry Hopkins, had to say about you?
One advisor who remained in the background yet exerted considerable influence was the Frenchman, Jean Monnet. He was no New Dealer. He was, in fact, a coldly calculating businessman who saw his own country suffer terrible defeat and Britain come close thanks to the refusal or inability of industrialists and soldiers to face the facts of total war. Monnet was the great single-minded apostle of all-out production, preaching the doctrine that 10,000 tanks too many are better than one too few.
I was lucky enough to be able sometimes to suggest what they might do.
You know perfectly well how important your role was. At the time, Supreme Court Justice Frankfurter wrote to Lord Halifax in the United Kingdom saying that you were a great teacher to the U.S. Defense Administration. The British advisor and economist, John Maynard Keynes himself, praised your action in the Victory Program.
When the United States of America entered the war, Roosevelt was presented with an aircraft production program, which most and all nearly all American experts thought would require a miracle. Jean Monnet was bold enough to find it inadequate. President Roosevelt came to agree with his point of view. He then set upon the American nation an industrial program which at first seemed impossible, but which later was completely fulfilled. This critical decision may have shortened the war by an entire year.
After the war, you set out on a single-minded mission to rebuild peace and prosperity in Europe.
Remember how our friend, the author and philosopher Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, used to say, the most beautiful job for a man is to unite men. Do you remember?
I do.
Well, I convinced myself that uniting the people of Europe was a vital necessity. There could be no real peace in Europe if states were allowed to reconstitute themselves on a basis of national sovereignty. Our countries in Europe are too small to guarantee their people the necessary prosperity and social development. Look at how huge the United States is, the USSR today, China and India tomorrow. Our countries in Europe are too small. Prosperity is impossible unless we form ourselves into a European federation. The only way to do that is through the creation of new institutions, because if nothing is possible without man, nothing lasts without institutions.
I recall the post-war period as the most exciting time of your career. It was in 1953, I believe. You wrote a note to yourself on your famous pink notepaper. It said, "My life only begins now. Everything until now has only been learning and preparation." You were 65 years old and just beginning the great work of your life.
You know, I never thought about it that way, but you're right. As soon as I returned to France to take charge of the reconstruction of the country, I became obsessed with finding ways to unite Europeans in an irreversible way. Since Franco-German rivalry was a threat to peace, let's transform it into a peaceful union. The idea of converting French and German coal and steel production under a single independent authority was revolutionary. Let us convert our arsenals of coal and steel into common industrial wealth.
The first test of Monnet's ideas was the addition of French and German coal and steel industries under joint control. This created a so-called higher authority, which was the ancestor of today's modern European Commission. In May 1950, under the agreement of West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman said these remarks penned by Monnet.
Through the consolidation of basic production and the institution of this new high authority, whose decision will bind France, Germany, and the other countries that join, this proposal represents a first concrete step towards a European federation, imperative for the preservation of peace.
That's when I became president of the European Coal and Steel Community's High Authority. We moved to Luxembourg, remember? I was of the firm belief that Franco-German cooperation would make future wars not only unthinkable, but materially impossible. Now, it was important back then to let the Americans know what we were doing because we needed their support. A united Europe could be a powerful partner and ally to the United States. And as I said in my speech to the National Press Club right here in Washington, D.C. in April of 1952, a united Europe is indispensable to the security and peace of the free world. I also explained in that same speech the spirit by which we were building this new Europe. We were not creating a coalition of states. We were uniting people.
But then there was the rejection of the European defense community. I remember how disappointed you were.
I was, but you know I'm not one to linger on what might have been. If it did not succeed, it simply means it wasn't a good idea. At the time. Let's see what future generations make of it. I always thought that Europe would be built through its crises and would become the sum of the solutions to these crises. But this setback made me realize that I needed to devote myself totally to this united Europe. And so I left the high authority in 1955. And I created the Action Committee for the United States of Europe. It was a formidable force. We brought together Europe's main political parties and trade unions. We had great successes. The Treaty of Rome established the European Common Market and the Euratom in 1957. Great Britain joined the European Community in 1973. We planted the seeds for European economic integration, and we pushed relentlessly for ever greater political union across the countries of Europe.
And all the while, you were keen that European integration should lead to a partnership of equals between Europe and the United States. I remember how fond you were of President Kennedy.
I always thought that the United States and Europe shared a common attachment to a civilization built on individual freedom and conducted their public life according to common democratic principles. As far as partnerships go, there can be no partnership without a partnership of equals. The alternative is domination. And so, yes, I sought to create a partnership with the United States of equals. And I was impressed with the young Kennedy's understanding of this. When I went to New York to receive the Freedom Prize in 1963, President Kennedy sent me a message.
Dear Monsieur Monnet, for centuries, emperors, kings, and dictators have tried to impose unity on Europe by force. For better or worse, they have failed. But under your inspiration, Europe has come closer to unity in less than 20 years than it had done before in 1,000. You and your associates have built with the mortar of reason and the brick of economic aid and political interest. You are transforming Europe by the power of a constructive idea. And we have also recognized with you that a strong Europe is good not only for Europeans, but for the world. America and Europe, working in full and effective partnership, can find solutions to those urgent problems that confront all mankind at this crucial time.
My grief on the day of his loss I cannot describe. The bearers of hope are never of an age to die. Roosevelt had a universal view of things. Freedom, for him, was indivisible. It did not stop at the frontiers of his country. Kennedy's strength was of the same order, and his vision of the same breadth.
President Kennedy had decided to confer upon you, Jean, one of the very first presidential medals of freedom. I will never forget that ceremony performed by President Lyndon Johnson just 2 weeks after Kennedy's funeral, and in the presence of Mrs. Kennedy, who watched quietly from a dark corner of the room.
Citizen of France, statesman of the world, he has made reason and persuasion into the weapons of statecraft, moving Europe closer towards unity and the Atlantic states towards a more enduring partnership.
Jean, the sun will be setting soon. Would you like to go for one last walk with me in Rock Creek Park?
Yes, ma chérie, we must continue our walk and our discussions, for the task of uniting people is never ending. And as you well know, I let my legs do the thinking for me.
Here is what Georges Bertoin, now he was Monet's chief of staff at the European Coal and Steel Community and later EC ambassador to the United Kingdom. Here is what he had to say about Jean and Sylvia.
Monet spoke of his marriage as the most beautiful operation of his career. He married Sylvia, who was Italian, and grew up trilingual in Italian, French, and Greek, and became a French citizen in 1939. And he added the instinct of what Sylvia brought to his bases in Charente and the United States, thanks to the considerable influence of his wife. She explained to him marvelously what it was that he did not feel. Monet would spend hours writing to his wife, whose opinion mattered to him more than that of anyone else. It was truly a human achievement between the two. I consider that we would not understand Monet if we forgot Sylvia.
And here is what the Washington Post had to say about Monet.
Washington, D.C. would always be a special place for the Monets. As the Washington Post wrote of Jean Monnet upon his passing in 1979, he belonged to that very small group of statesmen who seize a noble but improbable idea and live long enough to see their countrymen not only accept it, but also begin to take it for granted. A young Frenchman now goes to Germany just as casually as his counterpart in Virginia might go to New York, with hardly a passing thought to the way things otherwise may have been.
And now it is my great honor to introduce Jean-Marc Lieberherr, grandson of Jean Monnet and president of the Jean Monnet Institute.
Well, not being a professional or even an amateur actor, I'm lucky that I have to play myself, so I cannot be completely out of character. I can certainly attest of the symbiotic relationship between my grandfather and my grandmother. They had two daughters, born 10 years apart. My mother, Marianne, was born in 1941 here, which made her technically an American citizen named after the French Republic. I myself was born in 1966 in the very home that Sylvia and Jean moved to in 1945 after they returned from Washington, D.C. It's nothing grand. It's a farm near Paris. Actually, their friend John McCloy went to visit them in Christmas 1945. He wanted to check on the family, and when he returned, he wrote on his diary, "The family seems happy. It's somewhat basic and rudimentary. I'm a little bit worried about the cold winter coming." I actually passed the winter, and everything was quite fine. That's really where my three siblings and I spent our holidays and our weekends with our grandparents. Our grandfather was a calm and affectionate man of few meaningful words. He didn't speak too much as kids, but he was happy to have us around him, like you'd have pets running around you. That made him feel great, and us as well, I guess. In 1975, at last, age 87, he decided to retire, to write his memoirs, which he'd been procrastinating for 15 years, because really writing about the past was not something he was really interested in. He even asked, can you write your memoirs about the future and not the past? If you read the book, which some of you might have done, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to do it, you'll see that I actually wrote his memoirs about the future. My grandfather passed away in March 1979. The countryside was covered with snow that morning. And my grandmother, who was deeply religious and somewhat superstitious as a good Italian, saw it as a sign of God because he liked his mountain and his skiing so much. She herself passed away 3 years later in Rome, her hometown. In 1988, President François Mitterrand, on the 100th anniversary of Jean Monnet's birth, decided to have his ashes moved to the Pantheon. And we asked ourselves whether we should let that happen because, on that occasion, Jean and Sylvia would be separated. And eventually we decided that we should because remember what he used to say, that there is no sacrifice that you shouldn't do to fulfill a worthy objective. Thank you very much.
Friends of France and America, tonight's tale of Jean and Sylvia Monnet has come to an end. But their legacy of Franco-American friendship and partnership inspires anew. Please join me in a round of applause and a toast to Jean and Sylvia Monnet and to the French presidency of the European Union 2022.
Take a bow with the cast.
You're supposed to hold my hand. I'm going to be between you guys.
That.
Who needs?
Thank you.
Well done.
Such an honor. Such an honor.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you.